The dust hadn't settled yet when he leaned back against the sandbags, blood soaking through his uniform and pooling beneath him. His rifle was gone, his helmet cracked open on the ground a few meters away. But his eyes were calm. Not wide with fear, not glassy with pain, just still, steady, as if he had already accepted something the rest of us were still trying to avoid. The noise from the last burst of gunfire was still echoing in my ears, but around him, the world felt eerily quiet. There was no screaming, no orders shouted, no urgency left. Just him, slumped in a shallow pocket of shade, and me, crouched next to him, not knowing what to say or whether I should say anything at all. He looked like he was waiting for something. Not rescue, not salvation, but something smaller, more human. Not a miracle, just a moment. My hands were trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of helplessness. He was bleeding from somewhere deep. We both knew no medic would get there in time, and even if they did, it wouldn't change anything. He had minutes, maybe seconds. That's when I remembered the cigarette in my chest pocket. It was crumpled, probably broken. I hadn't even meant to bring it. I hadn't smoked in weeks. But it was there, between ration wrappers and a loose round I never chambered. I pulled it out like it meant something, like it could do something. He watched every motion with those same tired eyes. No pleading, no words. Just watching. I struck the match slowly, cupping it from the wind, hands dirty and shaking. The flame held for a second, just enough. I brought it to the end and saw the paper glow, and he inhaled, not sharply, but gently, like the breath of someone already half gone. The smoke curled from his lips like a final breath, drawn not out of need, but memory. He closed his eyes, leaned back further, and held the cigarette between two fingers like it was a lifeline or a goodbye. There was no sound but the burning tip, faint and slow. I didn't look away. I didn't cry. I just stayed there with him, because leaving would have felt like theft. He took another drag, then none. His fingers went still, the ember faded, and that was it. No drama. No final words. Just silence. Just stillness. And one last curl of smoke rising into a sky that didn't stop to notice. It was the last cigarette I ever carried. But I kept carrying it anyway. They arrived under a washed-out morning sky, the sun barely rising above the dusty ridgeline, painting the hills with a faint, colorless glow. The transport truck kicked up a long trail of grit behind it, the sound of its tired engine the only thing cutting through the silence of the battered town they were entering. What remained of the hospital stood crookedly in the center of the compound, its windows blown out, rebar exposed in jagged streaks like veins of rusted bone. It had once been a functioning civilian medical facility, or at least something close to it, before the front lines swept over it again and again, reducing it to a shell where soldiers slept, watched, and waited for contact. This was where they would be stationed. No signs, no gates, no flags. Just a few stacked sandbags and a dirt track that looked more like erosion than a road. There were 16 of them in total. 12 already assigned to this forward position and 4 fresh replacements, transferred in with minimal notice and fewer explanations. Reyes was among the new arrivals, quiet in the back of the truck, helmet low, boots planted. They'd been briefed, if it could be called that. The location was listed as low activity, which anyone with experience knew meant neglected, unstable, and waiting to explode at the wrong moment. Intelligence didn't confirm much. Movement had been reported, contacts, uncertain. Some drone flyovers, some intercepted chatter, nothing definitive, and yet everyone who stepped off the truck that morning did so with the quiet knowledge that their stay here would not be uneventful. The base was alive in the slow mechanical way that made war feel routine. A radio crackled with static as a staff sergeant issued movements to the rooftops. A young private swept out shattered glass from a hallway that no longer had a roof. Soldiers moved about in loose patterns, focused but tired, rifles slung low, eyes flickering over the horizon more out of habit than immediate fear. Each carried that blend of readiness and fatigue that came after too many rotations with no clean end. Reyes and the others were shown to their quarters, or what passed for them. A side room with 3 cots, a rusted fan, and graffiti etched into the walls by previous units. The smell was a mix of sweat, oil, and disinfectant that hadn't been used in months. Gear was dropped silently. No one unpacked much. No one spoke longer than necessary. In places like this, introductions came slowly, usually through necessity, not invitation. The walls had holes in them that had been stuffed with jackets or sand-filled trash bags. The floors creaked from bullet damage that no one had ever bothered to fix. By midday, the sun was high enough to bleach the color from the sky. Patrol rotations were assigned, observation posts established. The compound had 3 watch points, none with full cover, and 1 radio that had to be shared between the roof teams. Ammo was distributed conservatively, 4 mags each, 1 frag per person, and a silent nod that said, "Don't expect resupply." The med station had been half looted before they got there. Only gauze, a few injectors, some morphine, no stretchers, no surgical kits. If something went wrong, it would stay wrong. Reyes was put on second shift, sunset to early night. For now, he walked the perimeter with the others, mapping the blind spots, the choke points, the fallback positions. There was no high ground, no real field of fire. The hospital was surrounded by skeletal buildings, some reduced to frames, others still partially intact. Perfect for ambushes, perfect for traps. The road leading in from the east was littered with the rusting remains of previous convoys, scorched metal husks, and bullet-riddled doors that whispered about the last time someone thought this place was quiet. The first evening passed slowly. The heat didn't break, even as darkness began to fall. They ate in silence, chewing through packaged rations with automatic movements, eyes always scanning, ears always tuned for the wrong sound. Crows circled above, drawn to the smell of burned rubber or something worse. At night, there were no lights. Flashlights were used sparingly. The compound ran on a single, unreliable generator that coughed and sputtered every hour until it finally gave up. After that, it was glow sticks and moonlight, and nothing else. In the dark, the walls seemed to move. Wind whispered through holes in the plaster, carrying voices that didn't belong to anyone. Every creak of concrete, every shifting shadow pulled at nerves already stretched thin. And still, the radio stayed quiet. No contact, no sightings, just silence and anticipation, the kind that grows heavier the longer nothing happens. Reyes stayed up longer than his shift required, not out of duty, but because sleep felt impossible. He sat against a broken doorway, staring out across the empty street, rifle across his lap. The stars above him looked pale, distant, somewhere far from all of this. Around him, other soldiers shifted in their sleep or stared at the walls, eyes open, unmoving. The quiet wasn't peace. It was warning. The kind that always comes before something breaks. Under the midday sun, the compound had fallen into a lull. The heat was oppressive, the kind that pressed down on shoulders and soaked through gear. The walls shimmered faintly with rising waves of heat, and the silence that draped across the hospital grounds had become normal. No chatter on the radio, no movement beyond the broken buildings in the distance. Most of the men were inside, or lying in shaded corners, dozing in and out of sleep, their weapons resting within arm's reach. Even the flies buzzed slower. Then the world shattered. The first blast came without warning. No whine of incoming, no rustle of feet, just a sudden, violent eruption that tore through the western perimeter of the compound, like a god slamming his fist into the earth. The ground heaved beneath Reyes, throwing dust and shrapnel into the air. His ears rang instantly, drowning out everything else in a wave of sound that muffled the next few seconds, like cotton stuffed into his head. Screams followed. Some near, some far, none distinct. Instinct took over. Reyes was already crawling for his rifle before his brain caught up. The second explosion hit as he reached the edge of the hallway, slamming into the remains of the upper floor and showering him in grit and stone. Bits of ceiling came down like hail, chunks of plaster and brick bouncing off his back and helmet. Someone was yelling something near the main stairwell, but it was lost in the chaos. Automatic fire cracked in the distance, sharp, irregular, not a sustained attack. Probing fire, bursts from different angles. Not meant to breach, just confuse. Force everyone into the open. From above, a voice screamed out and then cut off with terrifying finality. Reyes pushed toward the central room of the hospital, where 2 others had taken position behind an overturned metal desk. The windows had been blown out, jagged glass and wire hanging like teeth. He dropped to his knee beside them, heart pounding, sweat and dust sticking to his face. Outside, the narrow street flickered with motion, shadows ducking behind cars, muzzle flashes from upper windows, then silence again. It was like the enemy was everywhere and nowhere all at once. A third explosion ripped through the front wall. This one smaller, sharper. A mortar, or an RPG. The blast knocked out a section of the entryway and with it, one of the replacements. Reyes saw the silhouette collapse before he could even process it. Blood sprayed the wall. No one had time to react. The remaining soldiers returned fire blindly, suppressing into corners of the open courtyard. Dirt and fragments of concrete filled the air. Someone pulled the wounded man out of sight, dragging him by the vest, but he wasn't moving anymore. The radio crackled once, then died. The antenna had been damaged, or the generator finally gave up. There was no command, no coordination, just survival. Everyone was scattered across the building, trying to make sense of a fight that was unfolding in waves, coming from multiple angles, never staying long enough to be predictable. It wasn't a siege. It was disorientation, a slow drowning in noise, fear, and dust. Reyes and another soldier took to the staircase, crawling to the second floor where they hoped to spot the direction of the fire. As they reached the landing, bullets punched through the drywall above them, sending dust and chunks flying. They dropped, sliding across the floor until they could find a corner to post up. The roof access was closed off. The blast from earlier had collapsed part of the stairwell. They were pinned, vision limited to what little they could see through the bullet-pocked windows. From their position, Reyes saw movement across the adjacent building. A shooter, briefly silhouetted. He squeezed off a short burst. The figure dropped or disappeared. Hard to tell. More motion near the alley. Another burst of automatic fire. The chaos was layered now. Somewhere a grenade exploded. Somewhere someone was yelling into a dead radio. Footsteps ran through the halls below. Metal scraped against metal. Every sound carried urgency and finality. Downstairs, another group began consolidating near the rear stairwell, trying to regroup. Reyes could hear them shifting furniture, building a makeshift barrier. Anything to delay a push if it came. Ammunition was being counted, redistributed. Medics moved between the wounded like ghosts, heads low, hands shaking. They were out of morphine already. Only pressure bandages and tape remained. Then came the scream. Not the kind of pain scream, but one of panic. Someone shouting for help near the south side. A man down. Reyes didn't see who it was, but he heard the fear in it, the desperation, and then silence again. He made his way back downstairs as the sun shifted westward, and the light started cutting across the building at a harsh angle, illuminating streaks of blood on the walls and floor. Dust hung thick in the air like fog. The body of the replacement was still near the front entrance, barely covered. No one had the time to move him. Everyone was either fighting, bleeding, or preparing for the next wave. By late afternoon, the gunfire had lessened, but no one relaxed. This wasn't the end of the assault. It was the pause. The moment when both sides reassess. The enemy hadn't retreated. They had simply stepped back, waiting for the dark to do the work for them. Inside, the temperature dropped with the sun, but the pressure didn't. Reyes sat in a corner, eyes burning from smoke, dirt embedded under his nails, his ears still buzzing from the blasts. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. The adrenaline hadn't worn off. His stomach felt hollow, but the thought of eating was laughable. Around him, the others moved like shadows, checking corners, double-checking ammo, laying strips of cloth over shattered glass to muffle footsteps. They didn't talk unless necessary. There was nothing to say. They all knew the night would come with more than just darkness, and they weren't sure how many of them would still be alive when the sun rose again. Under the heavy cloak of dusk, the compound felt like a tomb. The air, once sharp with gunfire and shouting, had grown still. The dust no longer swirled from explosions but drifted lazily in the faint breeze, hovering in the golden light that spilled through bullet-punched holes in the walls. Every surface was coated in a film of soot and debris. Blood streaks marked the concrete floors, some smeared, others left in perfect shapes where bodies had been dragged. The few unshattered windows now reflected only flickers of orange fire from the distance. Burning wreckage or enemy flares no one had the time or courage to investigate. Reyes moved carefully through the lower level of the building, eyes adjusting to the gloom, rifle up though his hands ached from gripping it too long. His shoulders burned. His throat was dry and coarse from smoke. His boots crunched softly over broken glass and dried blood. Each sound seemed amplified in the quiet. Every corner he rounded brought the risk of another shot, another surprise. But the worst had passed, at least for now. He found Kato in the far hallway behind the communications room, a place where the walls were thickest and the air stifling. Kato was on his back, his legs bent slightly, arms splayed. One hand rested lightly over his abdomen, the other limp at his side. His vest had been unstrapped and pushed open by one of the medics, revealing a patch of gauze already soaked through with blood, dark and spreading. It had pooled beneath him and soaked into the dirty concrete, forming a black halo that glistened in the fading light. The medics had moved on. There were others still screaming, others with a better chance. They had done what they could, bandaged the entry, said a few words, left a pressure pack on top of his chest, and kept moving. Kato's eyes were still open. Not wide, not panicked, just staring softly at the cracked ceiling above him. His chest rose and fell, but the rhythm was weak, broken. Each breath seemed thinner than the last. His lips were dry, slightly parted, and his face looked pale beneath the grime, like something was being slowly drained out of him with every passing second. Reyes crouched beside him, unsure why. He hadn't known Koto well, just another name, another face in the rotation. They'd barely exchanged words. A few nods, maybe a handoff of equipment, nothing more. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The hallway was empty, except for the two of them and the fading echoes of distant gunfire outside the compound walls. Koto turned his head slightly, barely perceptible, as if to acknowledge Reyes's presence. The movement took effort. His neck trembled from it. His fingers flexed against the floor once, then stilled. Reyes looked at the gauze again. It was no longer absorbing. The blood was too much. The pack was failing. The bullet had gone deep, probably puncturing the liver or lower lung. Maybe both. Reyes wasn't a medic, but he had seen enough wounds to know the difference between bad and final. This one had crossed that line. He reached into his vest and pulled out his utility pouch, not knowing what he was looking for. Water, maybe. Something. But what came out instead was a half-crushed cigarette pack, bent and soaked with sweat. It had been there for weeks, untouched. Reyes hadn't smoked in months, but now here it was. Something small, stupid, and human in a place that had forgotten what that meant. He shook one out. Just one. The filter was bent. The paper frayed. He found a match in his ration pouch. Dry, barely. Shielding it from the breeze, he struck it and watched the tiny flame bloom, then touched it to the cigarette's end. It caught slowly, glowing orange, casting soft light across the blood-streaked floor and Kato's face. Reyes placed it gently in Koto's hand. He didn't have the strength to lift it. Reyes helped guide it to his mouth. Kato drew a single breath, shallow but full. The ember brightened, then dimmed. Another draw, and then another. The hallway remained quiet. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing grit across the shattered doorways and rustling torn fabric still hanging from a blown-out window. The cigarette burned slowly. Koto's eyes began to close, the lids lowering without resistance. His chest still moved, but softer now, fainter. The breathing became something more like a whisper than a function. Reyes didn't move. He sat back on his heels, resting his rifle across his thighs, watching the thin line of smoke drift upward, twisting into nothing. The hallway smelled of gunpowder, sweat, and now tobacco. Kato exhaled one last time. The cigarette slipped from his fingers and landed on the floor, its ember dying as it rolled against a crack in the tile. No sound. No reaction. His body went still in the soft, fading light. Reyes stayed for a long moment, eyes fixed on the space between breaths, waiting for one more that didn't come. When he finally stood, his knees cracked. He bent and picked up the still-warm cigarette, pinched it between his fingers, then tucked it into the cargo pocket of his pants. It left a faint burn on his glove. He turned without looking back, walking down the hall, past the empty rooms, through the rubble, and into the pale dusk. The radio was still silent. No one had called in for hours. The medics had begun loading the worst cases onto makeshift stretchers, preparing for possible extraction if it ever came. The compound smelled of smoke and defeat. Reyes sat beside the doorway alone, resting his back against the warm stone, and watched the stars begin to fade into view. He didn't take another cigarette from that pack. Not that night, not ever. But he never threw it away. Under the growing hush of early nightfall, the compound had shifted into a state of numb paralysis. The chaos had quieted, but it hadn't ended. The distant sounds of gunfire still punctuated the horizon in slow, inconsistent bursts. Somewhere beyond the hills, just far enough to sound detached from the blood still staining the floor at Reyes's feet. The sky had turned an eerie violet, streaked with ash and smoke that clung low, barely moving. Above the hospital roof, the last rays of sunlight flickered against a dirty haze. casting long, trembling shadows across the courtyard like fingers reaching in from some unseen threat. Inside, the walls were breathing their own kind of silence, stale, hollow, and full of weight. Reyes moved through the half-lit corridor with a stiffness that went deeper than fatigue. His steps were slow, deliberate, each footfall a quiet surrender to gravity and thought. The body count from the earlier engagement hadn't yet been finalized. No one had counted. There wasn't time, and no one had the stomach to start. The wounded had been stabilized. At least those who still responded to pressure or morphine. The rest had been left where they were found. Some marked with red tape around a boot. Others simply covered in a tarp or sheet, the kind of gesture that meant, "We know you were here." He found himself back in the same hallway, the one where Koto had died. The air hadn't changed. It still smelled of sweat, rust, and something deeper, like copper, and time had mingled and stuck to the floor. The cigarette was gone. He didn't remember removing it. The blood had dried to a deep, almost black brown, curling at the edges where it met the tile. His gaze dropped for a moment to the corner where Koto's body had rested, now empty but still echoing with presence. He hadn't realized until that moment how silent death could be. Not the violence of it, but the after. The stillness. The absence that buzzed louder than bullets. Somewhere down the hall, a generator hummed and sputtered to life, lighting a flickering panel overhead. It cast a sterile, bluish tone across the wall, bringing the damage into sharp relief. Bullet holes, cracked plaster, smeared fingerprints. The memory of earlier movement here rushed back, but without urgency. Only weight. He remembered how Koto had tried to move. Just a shift of the hand. A flutter of something human beneath the wreckage. Reyes blinked once, then looked away, pressing his fingers briefly against the wall to steady himself. When he emerged into the main courtyard, it was nearly empty. A few soldiers sat or crouched behind scattered barriers, sharing sips from canteens, checking weapons without speaking. Their faces were blank, not broken, just faded. Like too many layers had been peeled back, and now nothing but the core remained. There was no war cry, no speech, no camaraderie in this moment. Only eyes scanning the dark and ears tuned to absence. He crossed toward the old loading dock, where the medics had set up their temporary station. The triage zone was quieter now. Fewer moans, less movement. The wounded had either stabilized or hadn't. A medic with tired eyes and blood-soaked gloves sat slumped beside a stretcher, arms resting on his knees, staring into the distance. No one asked him questions. Everyone already knew the answers. Reyes passed him without a word and stepped through the narrow corridor leading to the back of the structure, where a broken section of wall looked out over the surrounding hills. He crouched in the shadows, resting his rifle against the rubble and exhaling slowly, letting his mind trace the memory of what had just happened. His hands still smelled faintly of cordite and tobacco. He had wiped them twice, but it lingered. The final drag, the moment the ember dimmed, the weight of the cigarette slipping from Koto's fingers. It all replayed, uninvited. Not as trauma, but as something gentler, crueler. A detail he hadn't earned but would carry anyway. Somewhere, a flare lifted into the sky. Pale green light arcing slowly before descending behind a ridge. A signal, a marker, or maybe a warning. The flare hissed and faded, casting brief shadows that danced across the shattered roofline. Reyes watched its trajectory without flinching. He didn't move until it disappeared completely, swallowed by the dark. Eventually, he stood and returned to the room where the rest of his unit had gathered. Those who had survived. They were eating in silence, faces lit by soft lantern light and the occasional flash from outside. No one filled the silence. Food was passed, gear checked, shifts rotated. Routine became religion. The kind of repetition that kept a man upright when nothing else could. He sat, took his share, and listened to the creaks of the walls and the shallow breathing of others. The presence of loss hung heavy, but unspoken. No one mentioned names. There would be time for that later, if they made it out. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked, or maybe it was something else. But no one moved. No one rose. The last seconds of Koto's life played again in his mind, but this time slower, longer. The way he had closed his eyes as though finally at peace. The way the smoke had risen into the light. The soft way the silence fell around them both. Not like a door slamming, but like snow. It was the kind of silence you couldn't outrun, you just lived in it. And if you were lucky, you carried it with respect. Under the weight of exhaustion and dust, the compound had fallen into a heavy, haunting stillness. It was not the stillness of safety, nor the kind that followed victory, but something deeper, something suspended, strained, a silence soaked in the aftermath of what had not fully passed. The sun had finally vanished behind the mountains, leaving behind only the dull glow of a smoky horizon and the cold, creeping breath of desert night. The walls of the hospital no longer echoed with gunfire or shouts, but with the kind of hollow quiet that made every small sound feel intrusive. Boots scuffing across concrete, the soft clink of spent casings being brushed aside, the low hum of someone's breath caught in their own throat. Reyes remained seated near the far corner of the second floor, the muzzle of his rifle resting gently against his knee. His hands, blackened with grime and dried blood, hung limp between his legs. He hadn't spoken in hours. No one had. Words felt inappropriate now, as though breaking the silence would undo the fragile boundary holding them together. Most of the others had gathered in pairs or small clusters, some tending to wounds, some just staring into the darkness, their eyes open, but not really seeing. From his position, Reyes had a partial view of the perimeter, or what was left of it. The western wall was fractured from multiple impacts, the sandbags burned and scattered, the makeshift watch post reduced to a twisted frame. What had once been a defensive line now resembled a graveyard of burnt fabric and broken stone. Pieces of gear were still scattered about, shredded vests, bent canteens, torn gloves, things left behind in the chaos. Some of it belonged to the dead, some perhaps to the living who simply hadn't noticed it missing yet. The wounded had been moved to a quieter wing, those who could walk, helped by those who barely could. Others had been laid in rows, covered in tarps, awaiting evacuation that may or may not come. Reyes hadn't asked how many were left, how many had been counted. It didn't matter anymore. The number would change again by dawn, whether from blood loss, shock, infection, or whatever came next. He leaned his head against the wall, letting the chill of the stone bleed into his skin. The back of his neck was raw from sun exposure. A long, shallow scrape just below his ear throbbed with each heartbeat. He could still taste the metallic bitterness of smoke in his mouth, and when he closed his eyes, all he could see was the hallway again. The red-streaked floor, the cigarette burning down to nothing, the hollow sound of a final breath leaving without. Ceremony. The others kept their own vigil in silence. Some cleaned their weapons with robotic efficiency, field stripping and reassembling with hands that had done it 1,000 times. Some slept with rifles still in hand, heads resting against their packs or a wall, mouths slightly open. Others just sat, like him, waiting for something that wasn't defined. An order, an end, a sound, anything to move them forward again. Far off in the distance, the occasional thud of indirect fire could still be heard, muffled by distance but present, like thunder warning of a storm that hadn't yet arrived. It was unclear whether it was outgoing or incoming. Maybe it didn't matter anymore. The enemy had not reappeared since the last flare hours ago. They might have pulled back, or they might have simply blended back into the hills, watching from the ridges. Sometimes the absence of an enemy was worse than their presence. It left the mind to fill the void with imagination and dread, with questions that had no answer. A thin wind drifted through the broken structure, tugging at loose tarps and scattered papers, sending them fluttering across the floor in lazy spirals. Somewhere above, a rusted door creaked back and forth on broken hinges. These small sounds felt louder now, more noticeable, like the world had compressed itself into only what could be heard and felt within the cracked stone and steel of that ruined building. Reyes ran his thumb along the edge of his dog tag, absently, over and over. He didn't think about it. It was just movement, something to prove to himself that time was still passing. The silence was thick, like wet cloth laid across his mouth and ears. Every movement felt too slow. Every thought seemed to echo. He wanted to sleep, but he couldn't. He wanted to forget the look in Koto's eyes, the slight tremble in his fingers, the way the smoke had curled upward and disappeared into a sky too empty to care. But the memory had already rooted itself. It would stay, whether he wanted it to or not. There was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, when he thought he heard music. Not real music, not coming from anywhere, just a whisper of melody, like a memory of a song half remembered in a dream. It faded quickly. Maybe it had never existed. Maybe it was the brain's way of protecting itself, giving him something soft in a place that had grown hard. Eventually, one of the sergeants came through, tapping shoulders, whispering names, organizing a tentative shift rotation for the night. Reyes didn't respond at first, didn't move. He just looked up, nodded once, and stood. His legs protested, knees stiff, joints aching like they belonged to someone twice his age. He moved into position like the others, eyes adjusting to the dim. The silence followed him, clinging to his boots, his back, the inside of his chest. And in that still, breathless night, as the stars above blinked through the haze and ash, the quiet wasn't peace. It was a pause, the kind you take when you know something's coming, but you don't yet know from where. When the convoy finally arrived just after sunrise, its engines low and heavy against the early silence, no one rushed to meet it. There was no celebration, no sound of boots scrambling toward rescue. The soldiers still alive stood quietly in the courtyard or watched from shattered windows, eyes dark from sleeplessness and dust, their movements slow, reserved, dulled by the weight of what had not yet left them. The sun crawled across the compound walls, casting long shadows through bullet holes and over scorched concrete. The wind had picked up slightly, but it carried only the dry smell of metal, old blood, and burning oil. They began loading the bodies first, gently, without orders, without names spoken aloud. One by one, wrapped in ponchos or sheets, carried by those who had shared rations and fire with them only days before. They were placed into the back of one of the trucks, carefully, as if they might still wake. No one watched for long. Each man turned away when it became too much. Some focused on their boots, others stared at the mountains. Reyes walked alone to the edge of the compound, standing near the break in the wall, where the sandbags had collapsed under pressure. From there, he could see the faint outline of the hills where the first fire had come from. The sky above them was pale, cloudless, and wide. He hadn't spoken since the night before. There was nothing left that needed to be said. The silence was no longer heavy, it was simply there, accepted. Part of him now. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the crushed cigarette pack, the one that had survived the mission, the one with a single stub left inside. It wasn't a tribute. It wasn't ritual. Just a habit now, a mark of something that had started with one breath and ended with none. He turned it between his fingers once, twice, then slipped it back into his pocket. It would go with him, wherever that was. When his name was called, he didn't flinch. He just picked up his gear, slung it over his back, and walked toward the vehicle. The others followed, quiet, carrying weight that couldn't be seen. The convoy rolled out slowly, its tires crushing spent shell casings and empty ration packs, its trail lost behind a cloud of rising dust. No one looked back. There was nothing left behind that hadn't already become part of them. The road ahead was long, silent, and empty. Not just of threats, but of certainty. What had happened in those broken walls would not be told fully, not in any report or story, not in the way it had been lived. It would fade layer by layer until only fragments remained. A stain on a glove, a scar below the collar, a sound remembered in sleep, but some things stayed. Some things, no matter how quiet, never left.